that there are nights when you realize you've spent years caring for monsters. Evelyn Brooks experienced that night in 1944 in a makeshift field hospital somewhere between Rouen and Caen, as occupied France was just beginning to breathe the air of liberation. She was 49 years old, with hands that never trembled during operations, and a faith in God so profound that she even prayed for the enemy soldiers she treated. But that night, kneeling behind crates of medical supplies, she understood that some prayers cannot erase what the eyes have seen. If you think you know the horrors of war, stay with me, because this story isn't about heroic battles or glorious victories. It's about what happens when evil hides behind a uniform and a charming smile, and what an ordinary woman is capable of when she realizes she has nurtured that evil with her own hands. Subscribe now, because you need to hear how a nurse who couldn't even kill a bug became the architect of a calculated massacre. The hospital was nothing more than a requisitioned farmhouse, its walls still smelling of hay and manure mingled with fresh blood and ether. The kitchen tables served as operating tables. The barn housed the convalescents. The attic stored medicines, bandages, and everything else needed to keep mangled men alive long enough to return to the front or go home. Evelyn led a team of 8 nurses, all exhausted, all haunted by the nighttime cries of soldiers reliving their nightmares in their sleep. She was known for her unwavering gentleness. Never a harsh word, never a complaint. She changed dressings with the same tenderness she would have shown a sick child, murmuring silent prayers over each infected wound. The soldiers called her Mother Brooks, though she had never had children of her own. Her husband had died 10 years earlier in a plowing accident, and since then she had dedicated her life to medical service, viewing each patient as a soul entrusted to her care by divine providence. Among the American soldiers passing through this makeshift hospital, one man stood out from the rest: Sergeant Sommer, 32 years old, with short blonde hair, a square jaw, and an easy smile. A hero, according to his comrades. He had survived 3 landings, saved 4 men under enemy fire, and wore the medals to prove it. When he spoke, the men listened. When he laughed, everyone laughed with him. He possessed the natural charisma of born leaders, the ability to transform fear into courage with a single glance. Evelyn had treated him twice, the first time for a minor shoulder injury, the second for a lung infection that had confined him to bed for a week. During that week, she had gotten to know Sommer beyond his reputation. He told her about his family in Ohio, about his mother who made the best apple pies in the county, about his little brother who wanted to be a pilot. He seemed almost vulnerable in those moments, lying on a cot, breathless, his eyes fixed on the low ceiling of the barn. But there was something else. A tension beneath the surface. A glint in his eyes when he thought no one was looking. Evelyn had learned to read men during all those years spent at the bedside of the sick and dying. She knew how to recognize pain, fear, remorse. In Sommer, she sensed something else, a contained excitement, a secret satisfaction that didn't fit the image of the hero he portrayed. One September evening, as rain pounded against the corrugated iron roof, Evelyn was making her last rounds before retiring to the small room she shared with 2 other nurses. Most of the patients were asleep, dazed by fatigue or painkillers. But as she passed the supply depot set up in the old stable, she heard voices, muffled laughter, the kind of masculine laughter that signals complicity, a shared secret. She should have just walked on. It wasn't her business. The soldiers needed these moments together, these respites where they could momentarily forget the horror that awaited them outside. But something in the tone of their laughter stopped her. There was a cruelty in it, a perverse joy. Evelyn approached silently. The barn door was ajar. Through the crack she could make out 4 figures sitting in a circle on ammunition crates, illuminated by a hurricane lamp on the floor. Sommer was in the center, holding something in his hand which he was showing to the others as a priest might present a sacred relic. "This one came from a German officer near St. Lo," he said proudly. "I had to force it a bit because it had a gold crown, but look how it shines." The other soldiers leaned forward for a better look. One of them whistled in admiration. Another asked if he could touch her. Cole nodded magnanimously, as if granting a favor. Evelyn narrowed her eyes, trying to understand what they were looking at with such fascination, and then she saw. In Cole Sommer's hand, glimmering faintly in the flickering lamplight, was a human tooth, a molar with a gold crown still stained with dried blood. Her stomach churned. Instinctively, she brought her hand to her mouth to stifle a gag reflex, but she didn't move. She remained there, paralyzed, unable to tear her gaze away from the obscene scene. "How many do you have now?" asked one of the soldiers. Cole smiled. 37. But I want 100 before the end of the war. One for every bastard I've taken down." "And what about civilians?" Cole's laughter turned darker. "Of course they matter, especially those who collaborated. They deserve a special place in my collection." Evelyn felt her legs give way beneath her. She leaned against the cold stone wall to keep from falling. The words echoed in her head like hammer blows. A collection. 37 human teeth ripped from slain enemies and executed civilians. And this man, this decorated hero whom everyone admired, spoke of them like a child, showing off his most prized marbles. Another soldier intervened. "Do you remember the village near Falaise, when we found that farmer who was hiding German weapons in his cellar?" Cole nodded. "Yeah. He was shouting that he didn't know anything, that he was just afraid to report them. But we knew he was lying." "How many teeth did you get there?" 3. The farmer, his wife, and the old man who tried to intervene. Cole carefully placed the molar in a small tin box. They should have thought before choosing the wrong side. The others nodded gravely, as if this twisted logic made sense, as if pulling the teeth out of terrified civilians was an acceptable form of wartime justice. Evelyn retreated slowly, inch by inch, praying the ground wouldn't creak beneath her feet. Her heart was pounding so hard she was certain they would hear her. But the men were too engrossed in their morbid conversation to notice her. She managed to reach the main building undetected, then ran to her room and locked herself in. That night, lying in the dark, her eyes wide open staring at the exposed beams of the ceiling, Evelyn Brooks understood 3 things with terrible clarity. Firstly, Cole Sommer was not a hero. He was a killer who had found in the war a legal excuse to satisfy impulses that civil society would have condemned. Secondly, he was not alone. He had formed around him a small group of soldiers who shared his perversions, who found it normal and even exciting to pull out the teeth of their victims like hunting trophies. Thirdly, and this was the most unbearable, she had nursed him back to health. She had used her skills, her gentleness, her prayers to restore a man who then went back to massacring innocent people and collecting their teeth like holiday souvenirs. She had fed the monster. She had kept it alive. She had been an unwitting accomplice. The next morning, Evelyn observed Cole Sommer with new eyes. He was having breakfast with the other soldiers, laughing at a joke, patting a comrade on the shoulder. He waved to her as he passed the infirmary, that charming smile still there, those blue eyes sparkling with good humor. To the rest of the world, he embodied everything an American soldier should be: courageous, loyal, protective. But now Evelyn saw what others couldn't. She saw the hands that had torn 37 teeth from corpses and victims who might still have been alive. She saw the perverse satisfaction behind the hero's mask. She saw the pent-up excitement of a collector who wanted only one thing: to add to his macabre hoard. And the question that would haunt her for weeks on end began to germinate in her mind, like a toxic seed planted in fertile soil. What was she supposed to do? Denouncing Cole Sommer would mean shattering troop morale, questioning military authority, risking accusations of enemy propaganda, or even female hysteria. In this war, heroes were needed. No one wanted to hear that they were pulling out their victims' teeth, but doing nothing meant accepting it, continuing to care for this man, watching him leave for other villages, other civilians, other victims who would end up dismembered in his morbid collection. Evelyn Brooks, who had never harmed anyone, who prayed for every lost soul, who believed in redemption and in the fundamental goodness of humanity, found herself facing a moral dilemma that surpassed anything she had imagined. And she understood with icy clarity that there was no right answer, only impossible choices. choices that would transform a nurse into something she never thought she could become. The following days passed in a suffocating normality. Evelyn performed her duties with the same efficiency as before, changing dressings, distributing medication, holding the hands of the dying. But something had broken inside her, an invisible membrane that separated her from the brutal truth of the world. Now, every gesture she made toward Cole Sommer felt like a betrayal of her invisible victims. She began to observe, no longer with the professional detachment of a nurse, but with the meticulous attention of an investigator gathering evidence. She mentally noted the comings and goings of Cole and his group, the 4 men who always accompanied him. Corporal Jenkins, a redhead from Boston with a face pockmarked by acne scars. Private Pierce, a silent giant from Montana who almost never spoke but laughed at all of Cole's jokes. Staff Sergeant Matthews, older in his 40s, a father of 3 according to him, who seemed to be the moral compass of this macabre brotherhood. And finally Private Garrett, barely 20, with dark eyes and a shifty gaze, the one who asked the most questions about extraction techniques. They formed a unit within the unit. They ate together, smoked together, disappeared together into the supply depot during their free time. The other soldiers respected them without really knowing them. Cole had this ability to maintain a calculated distance from the rest of the troops, close enough to be admired, far enough away to protect his secrets. Evelyn discovered that Cole Sommer wasn't who he claimed to be. Oh, the basic facts were true. He was indeed from Ohio. He did have a family, but by discreetly searching through the administrative files accessible at the infirmary, she found anomalies. Unexplained transfers from one unit to another, cryptic entries in his medical file, a psychiatric evaluation conducted after landing in North Africa, classified confidential with only a handwritten note in the margin, behavioral monitoring recommendation, not acted upon. Someone somewhere in the military hierarchy had noticed something unusual about Cole Sommer, but this warning had been buried, probably because he was too useful in the field, too effective at killing the enemy, too decorated to be questioned. One evening, Evelyn decided to cross a line she never imagined she would cross. She waited until the depot was empty, until the night patrols had come and gone, and slipped into the old stable with a flashlight hidden under her apron. Her heart was pounding so hard she could hear the blood pulsing in her temples. Her hands were trembling for the first time in years. The barn smelled of moldy leather and gun oil. Crates were stacked against the walls, labeled in white letters: ammunition, rations, medical supplies. Evelyn went to the back where she had seen Cole and his accomplices set up camp that terrible night. She lifted tarpaulins, moved empty crates, and searched behind sandbags. And she found it. A tin box engraved with the name C. Sommer, using a knife, was hidden behind a pile of military blankets. Evelyn lifted it carefully, as if handling a live grenade. She weighed the box in her hand. Light, almost harmless. She opened it. Inside, arranged in neat rows on a bed of cotton, were 42 human teeth. Some were still stained brown by dried blood. Others were meticulously cleaned, almost white. Several wore gold or silver crowns. One incisor had clearly belonged to a child. Evelyn slammed the box shut and placed it back exactly where she had found it. She staggered out of the barn, leaned against the outside wall, and vomited in the tall grass. She vomited until her stomach was empty, until only bitter bile remained, burning her throat. A child's incisor. Cole Sommer collected children's teeth. That night, Evelyn didn't sleep. She sat on her bed, an open Bible in her lap, unable to read a single word. The prayers wouldn't come. The words remained stuck in her throat, choked by a rage she had never felt before. A pure, burning rage that consumed her faith like fire devours dry paper. How could God allow such a man to exist? How could he let monsters wear the uniform of liberators? How could he demand that she, Evelyn Brooks, continue to care for this creature with gentleness and compassion? The next day she did something she had never done before. She listened, not to public conversations, but to the whispers among Cole's soldiers. She positioned herself strategically during meals, pretending to sort medical supplies near their tables. She moved slowly through the corridors during cigarette breaks, straining to hear snippets of sentences exchanged in low voices. And she began to reconstruct the horror. The village near Falaise was not an isolated incident. There had been others, many others. A hamlet near Carentan where 3 women accused of collaboration had been executed without trial. An isolated farm near Sainte-Mère-Église where an entire family had disappeared after sheltering retreating German soldiers. A cemetery near Bayeux where workers had been killed while digging trenches for the enemy under duress. Each time, Cole and his group had been present. Each time, the dead numbered in entire families. Each time, the official reports referred to pacification operations or legitimate reprisals against known collaborators. But Evelyn now knew what those neutral words concealed. Summary executions, planned massacres, terrified civilians begged for their lives while Cole Sommer calmly chose which teeth he would pull out once the job was done. The worst part was that no one seemed to care. Senior officers turned a blind eye, too busy managing the logistics of the Allied advance. Other soldiers preferred not to ask questions, grateful that someone else was taking care of the dirty work. And the surviving French civilians didn't dare testify against their American liberators, for fear of being accused of Nazi sympathies themselves. Cole Sommer operated in a perfect gray area, protected by the chaos of war, by his reputation as a hero, and by widespread indifference to the fate of suspected collaborators. One rainy afternoon in early October, Evelyn was tending to a young French soldier from the Free French Forces who had been wounded in an ambush. His name was Lucien. He was 23 years old, and from Rouen. While she cleaned his shoulder wound, he spoke. Perhaps because she had a motherly face. Perhaps because he needed to tell someone the truth. "Do you know Sergeant Sommer?" he asked in hesitant French mixed with broken English. Evelyn nodded without looking up from her work. "I was with him 2 weeks ago, in a village near here. We were looking for resistance fighters who might have information about German positions." Lucien paused, his eyes fixed on the ceiling. "We found a family. The father had hidden food for the Germans. Just food, you understand? Because they had guns and he was afraid for his children." Evelyn felt her hands freeze on the bandage she was wrapping. Sommer said we had to make an example of them, so the others would know what happens to traitors. Lucien's voice broke slightly. "He brought the whole family out. The father, the mother, 2 sons, a daughter. The youngest was maybe 8 years old." The silence stretched on, heavy as lead. "He executed the father first, then the mother. The children were crying. I wanted to intervene, but Matthews put his gun to my temple and told me to shut up if I didn't want to be next." Lucien closed his eyes. Sommer didn't kill the children. He let them go. But before that, he did something. Evelyn waited, although she already knew what would happen next. He took something from the father's mouth and the mother's with tweezers. I later understood that it was teeth. He collected their teeth like fucking collectible stamps. The young Frenchman opened his eyes and looked at Evelyn with desperate intensity. "Do you believe me? Because when I tried to talk to my commander about it, he told me I was in shock, that I'd misread things, that Sergeant Sommer was a decorated hero and that I'd better watch my accusations." Evelyn placed her hand on Lucien's. "I believe you, and you weren't wrong." It was the first time she had spoken those words aloud, the first time she had acknowledged in front of someone else the truth she carried like a crushing weight on her chest. Lucien shook his hand gratefully. "What can we do? How do we stop a monster when everyone refuses to see that he is a monster?" Evelyn had no answer. Not yet. But the question echoed within her like a bell in an empty cathedral. The days passed. Cole Sommer continued his routine, hero by day, collector by night. He joked with the other soldiers, helped new recruits settle in, wrote letters to his mother in Ohio. He lived 2 parallel lives and no one seemed able to see the crack between them. Then, one morning in late October, news arrived that changed everything. The base commander called a general meeting. Cole Sommer and his unit were to be transferred to the Eastern Front in 3 weeks. Destination: Germany. A new offensive was being prepared, and they needed experienced men. Soldiers who weren't afraid of close combat. Leaders capable of keeping their men in line under the worst conditions. Cole smiled when he received the news. A genuine, almost childlike smile. Germany. The heart of enemy territory. New opportunities, new villages, new collections to expand. Evelyn watched him celebrate with his comrades, toasting with cups of steaming coffee, and she understood with absolute clarity that if she did nothing, Cole Sommer would continue. He would cross Germany sowing terror, pulling the teeth out of German civilians, prisoners of war, perhaps even children lost in the chaos of Nazi defeat. And no one would stop him, because no one wanted to see, because it was easier to believe in the hero than to confront the monster. That night, Evelyn Brooks made a decision. She couldn't denounce him. The evidence would be swept aside. Her word against that of a decorated hero. She would be discredited, perhaps even institutionalized for nervous disorders. She couldn't kill him herself. She didn't know how. And even if she did, she would be immediately discovered and executed for murder. But she controlled something no one else in that field hospital controlled. She controlled the medications, the sedatives, the dosages, the medical evacuation protocols. She controlled who lived and who died when things went wrong. And she had just realized that she had the power to make things go very, very wrong. A plan began to form in his mind. A terrible plan. Immoral. Inexcusable before God and men. But it was also the only plan that would guarantee that Cole Sommer and his accomplices would never hurt anyone again. Evelyn Brooks, who had spent her life saving lives, was going to have to learn to take them. And she was going to have to live with that choice for the rest of her days. The first plot twist had just been revealed in all its clarity. The real story was not that of a nurse discovering a monster. It was the story of a nurse who herself became something monstrous in order to stop that monster. Evelyn's plan began to take shape in fragments, like a macabre puzzle pieced together in the icy silence of her sleepless nights. She couldn't tell anyone, not even the other nurses who shared her room, who would have been horrified by what she was contemplating. Not even Father Dominique, the military chaplain who visited the hospital every week and in whom she had always confided. Some sins cannot be confessed before they are committed. She spent days observing the medical evacuation protocols. Each week an ambulance transported the stabilized wounded to a larger military hospital in Caen, about 40 kilometers away. The journey took 2 hours on roads ravaged by bombing. The ambulance could carry up to 8 patients lying down, plus 2 nurses and a driver. The evacuations always took place in the late afternoon, after the enemy reconnaissance planes had finished their flights. Evelyn was responsible for designating which patients would be evacuated and in what order of priority. It was a task she had performed for months with impeccable professionalism, weighing each decision according to the severity of the injuries and the chances of survival. But now, she looked at those evacuation lists with different eyes. She saw an opportunity. The problem was simple in its monstrosity. How to get Cole Sommer and his 4 accomplices to leave in the same ambulance, with enough sedative drugs so that they could not react and create an accident that would seem absolutely natural in the chaos of war. An accident of which she would be the only survivor able to testify. The answer came to him as he studied the medical records. Cole was still suffering from residual lung complications from his infection. Matthews had developed a foot infection that required hospital follow-up. Jenkins had injured his hand during a maneuver. Pierce was showing symptoms of malaria contracted in North Africa, and young Garrett had asked to see a psychiatrist for what he called persistent nightmares. 5 men, 5 legitimate medical reasons to evacuate them together to Caen. Evelyn began preparing the ground with surgical precision. She slightly exaggerated the severity of their symptoms in the daily reports. She recommended further tests that were impossible to perform in the field hospital. She suggested that their morale might benefit from a temporary stay in a better-equipped hospital. No one questioned her assessments. She was the head nurse. Her word carried medical weight. On November 8, 1944, she finalized the evacuation list. Cole Sommer, Matthews, Jenkins, Pierce, and Garrett. would leave the next morning in the 10 o'clock ambulance. Traveling with them would be two other patients, a young soldier named Thomas, 19 years old, who had lost a leg and was to have it amputated higher up, and the French soldier Lucien, the one who had told him the story of the massacred family. 2 innocent people among 5 guilty ones. That was the price. Evelyn had calculated it coldly. She couldn't create an accident that would selectively kill only Cole's men. If she wanted it to look like a genuine accident, there had to be collateral damage. Acceptable damage, as military strategists would say. That night, she cried for the first time in weeks. She cried for Thomas, who would never see his 20th birthday. She cried for Lucien, who deserved to live after having the courage to testify. She cried for his immortal soul, which she was about to condemn to eternity. But she did not change her mind. On the morning of November 9th, Evelyn personally oversaw the preparation of the ambulance. She checked the stocks of morphine, sedatives, and bandages. She made sure everything appeared to be in order. Then, when no one was looking, she added something to the pre-filled syringes intended for the journey. A massive dose of chloral, a powerful sedative she had been discreetly diverting from the reserves over several weeks. The patients were to receive their injections 30 minutes before departure to cope with the uncomfortable journey. Cole and his men would receive doses that would plunge them into such a deep sleep that they wouldn't wake up for several hours. Thomas and Lucien too, all of them together, unconscious, unable to testify or react. The nurse assigned to accompany the patients was Margaret, a gentle and competent 25-year-old from Vermont. Evelyn took her aside an hour before departure. "Margaret, I have a favor to ask. My sister in Caen is ill. I haven't been able to see her for months. Would you mind if I took your place in the ambulance today? I promise to come back this evening." Margaret hesitated. It was against protocol for the head nurse to leave her post for a routine evacuation. But Evelyn had always been generous with her, granting her days off when she needed them. And besides, who could refuse a woman the right to see her sick sister? "Okay, Mrs. Brooks, but promise me you'll be careful on the road. The bombing has started again near Caen," Evelyn promised. Just another lie in the ever-growing list. At precisely 10 a.m., the 7 patients were loaded into the ambulance. All were sound asleep thanks to the injections administered by Evelyn herself. Cole Sommer lay on a stretcher, his face relaxed and almost peaceful, unaware that he had just received his last dose of medication. Matthews was snoring softly. Jenkins had his mouth open. Pierce and Garrett looked like sleeping children. Thomas and Lucien were also asleep, their youthful faces relaxed in artificial sleep. Evelyn climbed into the back of the ambulance. The driver, a corporal named Peterson, closed the doors and got behind the wheel. The engine coughed and sputtered in the cold November air, then started. For 40 minutes they drove along potholed roads. The ambulance jolted violently over every bump, throwing the stretchers against their safety straps. Evelyn sat on the small folding seat, her hands resting on her knees, her face impassive. She wasn't praying. Prayers had lost their meaning. She knew exactly where it would happen. 23 kilometers from Caen, the road crossed over an old stone bridge built in the 18th century. The bridge had been partially destroyed during the D-Day bombings and then hastily repaired by military engineers. But the structure remained fragile, and a sign advised heavy vehicles to slow down. 15 minutes before reaching the bridge, Evelyn checked one last time that all the patients were sound asleep. Then she leaned forward and knocked on the small window that separated the back of the ambulance from the driver's cab. Peterson opened the trap door. "Is something wrong, Mrs. Brooks?" "Patient number 3 is showing signs of respiratory distress. We need to speed things up. We must get to Caen as quickly as possible." Peterson nodded and closed the hatch. The engine roared and the ambulance accelerated. Evelyn sat back down. Her heart beat calmly. Her hands didn't tremble. She had entered that state of icy clarity that surgeons experience during the most delicate operations. No more room for doubt, only action. The ambulance was approaching the bridge. Evelyn stood up and discreetly opened a small medical supply box attached to the wall. Inside, hidden under bandages, was an incendiary grenade she had stolen several days earlier from the weapons depot. She had modified it with the unwitting help of a young mechanic to whom she had explained that she wanted to understand its mechanism in order to better treat combat burns. The grenade was equipped with a time delay fuse. 30 seconds. The ambulance was now driving up onto the bridge. Evelyn could hear the sound of the wooden planks, hastily laid down by the engineers, creaking under the weight of the vehicle. She pulled the pin on the grenade and placed it in a corner near the emergency fuel tank stored in the rear. Then she banged violently against the partition wall, shouting, "Peterson, stop immediately. Serious medical problem." The ambulance slammed on its brakes in the middle of the bridge. Peterson jumped out of the cab and opened the rear doors. "What's going on?" Evelyn jumped out of the ambulance. "The patient is having serious breathing difficulties. I need fresh air to assess his condition. Help me get him out." Peterson climbed into the back to unfasten Thomas's stretcher. It was then that Evelyn shoved him violently, knocking him off balance. He fell heavily inside the ambulance, hitting his head against a metal frame. He remained dazed for a few seconds, just long enough. Evelyn slammed the doors and locked them from the outside with the security padlock. She counted in her head. 20 seconds. Peterson got to his feet inside, confused, beginning to understand. He banged on the doors. "Mrs. Brooks, what are you doing? Open up." 15 seconds. Evelyn stepped back slowly, her gaze fixed on the ambulance, which was swaying slightly under Peterson's desperate blows against the metal doors. 10 seconds. She thought of the little girl who had lost her parents, of the child's teeth in Cole Sommer's box, of the burned villages, of the massacred families. 5 seconds. She also thought of Thomas, who would never see his mother again, of Lucian, who had had the courage to testify, of Peterson, who was just doing his job. 0. The explosion was deafening. The ambulance exploded in a ball of orange fire that tore through the gray November sky. The blast threw Evelyn backward, sending her rolling across the cracked asphalt of the bridge. She felt the intense heat burn her face, heard the metal twist with a metallic screech, and then the ominous creak of the bridge's wooden planks giving way under the weight of the burning vehicle. The ambulance tipped over. It slid slowly at first, as if in slow motion, then plummeted into the void with a terrifying crash. Evelyn crawled to the edge of the bridge and looked down. 15 meters below, the smoking wreck lay in the dry riverbed, flames devouring what remained of the bodywork. 8 men inside, 8 lives extinguished in seconds. Evelyn lay there, face down at the edge of the chasm, watching the blaze consume the evidence of her crime. She should have felt something. Horror, remorse, maybe even relief. But she felt nothing, just an immense emptiness, as if something essential within her had been charred along with the ambulance. She doesn't know how long she stayed like that. Minutes, maybe an hour. The November cold bit at her skin, but she didn't really feel it. She was elsewhere, in a place beyond physical pain, beyond even guilt. It was the sound of an engine that brought her back to reality. A military jeep was approaching, likely alerted by the column of black smoke visible for miles. Evelyn sat up with difficulty. She touched her face and felt blood trickling from a cut on her forehead. Her clothes were torn, covered in dust and soot. She looked exactly as she must have, a miraculous survivor of a tragic accident. The soldiers who got out of the jeep found her in a state of apparent shock, sitting on the edge of the bridge, staring fixedly at the wreckage below. She did not resist when they gently lifted her, covered her with a blanket, and placed her in the back of their vehicle. "Madam, what happened?" Evelyn looked at them with blank eyes. She had mentally rehearsed this moment dozens of times. She knew exactly what to say, how to say it, what level of trauma to display. The bridge. There was a strange noise. The driver braked, and then the explosion. I don't know. Maybe a mine, or an unexploded shell. I got out to check on the patients and... Her voice broke in a perfectly believable way. The ambulance fell. All those men. The soldiers exchanged grave glances. This kind of accident was sadly common. The roads were mined, the bridges weakened, and unexploded shells littered the French countryside. It wasn't implausible that the ambulance had struck something dangerous. Evelyn was taken back to the field hospital. The base commander, Major Harrison, came to see her in the infirmary where her superficial wounds were being treated. He was a gaunt man in his 50s, who bore the marks of war on his face like a permanent scar. "Mrs. Brooks, I am sorry for what happened. We lost some brave men today." Evelyn nodded silently. She kept her eyes lowered, focusing on her trembling hands resting on her knees. Genuine trembling now, caused by the receding adrenaline. "We'll conduct an investigation, of course, but according to initial reports, it appears the ambulance ran over an unexploded ordnance. These things are everywhere." He paused. Sergeant Sommer was a hero. His loss is considerable. Evelyn raised her eyes slightly. "There were other men in that ambulance, Major. Not just decorated heroes. Young soldiers who also deserve to go home." Harrison seemed surprised by the tone, but he nodded. "You're right. Every life lost is a tragedy. I will personally write to the families." The following days unfolded in a bureaucratic fog. A commission of inquiry was formed. Officers examined the charred remains of the ambulance. They found metal fragments consistent with an improvised explosive device, likely a German mine or the remnants of a shell. The explosion had been so violent that any detailed analysis was impossible. The bodies had been so badly burned beyond recognition. Evelyn was questioned 3 times. She repeated the same story each time with slight, natural variations in the details, as someone might when reliving a trauma. She cried at appropriate moments. She had believable lapses in attention. She asked for forgiveness for having survived while her patients had died. Nobody suspected anything. How could they have? Evelyn Brooks was the exemplary head nurse, a woman of faith, a lifesaver. The idea that she could have deliberately caused a massacre was simply inconceivable. The final report concluded that it was a tragic accident caused by an enemy explosive device. The 8 victims were honored at a solemn ceremony. Cole Sommer posthumously received an additional medal. His comrades delivered moving eulogies for his courage, leadership, and ultimate sacrifice for freedom. Evelyn attended the ceremony, dressed in her impeccably pressed nurse's uniform. She listened to the speeches. She bowed her head during the prayers. She shook hands with the officers who offered their condolences for the ordeal she had endured. And all the while, she thought about the tin box containing 42 human teeth, probably destroyed in the fire or buried under the rubble. The physical evidence of Cole Sommer's true nature had vanished with him. No one would ever know what he had really been, except for her. The night after the ceremony, Evelyn went to the now empty old barn. Cole's unit had been disbanded after his death, the remaining men reassigned elsewhere. The supply depot seemed abandoned, haunted by the ghosts of morbid conversations that only Evelyn could still hear. She methodically searched the place where Cole hid his collection. The box was gone. Had someone found it? Had it been moved with Cole's belongings to be sent back to his family in Ohio, or had it simply been thrown away by a soldier who didn't understand what was inside? Evelyn would never know. And in a way, that was fitting. Cole Sommer's secrets had died with him, just as a vital part of Evelyn Brooks had died on that bridge. Margaret, the nurse whom Evelyn had replaced that day, came to see her a week after the accident. Her eyes were red from crying. "Mrs. Brooks, I don't know how to thank you. If I had been in that ambulance way, I would have been the one who died." Evelyn took the young woman's hands in her own. "Don't thank me, Margaret. I don't deserve any gratitude. But your sister in Caen. You were able to see her at least." Evelyn looked at her, uncomprehending for a moment, then remembered the lie she had invented to take Margaret's place. "No, I don't have a sister in Caen. I never have." Margaret looked confused. "But you said—" "I lied." Evelyn released Margaret's hands and turned away. "I lied to get into that ambulance, because I knew what was going to happen." The silence that followed was so heavy it seemed to suck the oxygen out of the room. Margaret took a step back, her face changing from confusion to disbelief to horror. "What are you saying?" Evelyn didn't answer immediately. Part of her wanted to confess everything, to unload it all on that innocent young woman, to share the crushing weight of what she had done. But she knew she couldn't. This burden was hers alone to bear. Nothing, I'm in shock, I'm just talking nonsense. She forced a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Forget what I said, Margaret, it's just nerves. But Margaret didn't forget. Evelyn saw it in her eyes in the weeks that followed. The young nurse looked at her differently now, with a cautious distance, as if she had glimpsed something terrible and preferred not to delve deeper. November passed in a mechanical routine. Evelyn performed her duties with the same efficiency as before, but something essential had changed. The other nurses noticed. She no longer prayed before meals. She no longer read her Bible during breaks. She hardly spoke anymore, except when absolutely necessary. Father Dominique tried to speak to her during his weekly visit. "My daughter, I sense that your soul is troubled. Will you go to confession?" Evelyn looked at him with eyes that had seen too much. "Father, some sins are beyond absolution. Some souls are too damaged to be saved. No soul is lost as long as it seeks God's forgiveness. What if I don't seek forgiveness? What if I do exactly the same thing again under the same circumstances?" Father Dominique had no answer to that. In early December, Evelyn received a letter. It was from Cole Sommer's mother in Ohio. A touching letter written in a trembling hand, thanking Evelyn for the care she had given her son during his final weeks. The mother recounted what a good boy Cole was, how much he loved helping others, and how much they missed him. "My Cole collected things during the war," she wrote. "His personal effects were returned to me, and I found a small box with white stones inside. I suppose he collected them on the beaches where he fought. He was always a sentimental child." White stones. His mother thought they were stones. Evelyn burned the letter in the infirmary fireplace. She watched the paper smolder, the words of maternal love turning to black ashes, and she wondered if Cole's mother would have loved her son as much if she had known what that box truly contained. Probably. That's what mothers do. They love them no matter what. But Evelyn was not a mother, and she had made a choice that even God could never justify. A choice that would haunt her until her dying breath. The war ended in May 1945, but for Evelyn Brooks, it continued indefinitely in the silence of her sleepless nights. She left France in June, repatriated with the last American medical teams. She was offered a medal for her exceptional service. She politely declined, explaining that she had only done her duty. No one pressed her. The most admirable heroes are always the unassuming ones. She returned to a small Massachusetts town where no one knew her. She rented an apartment on the second floor of a dilapidated Victorian house, took a job at a local hospice, and disappeared into the anonymity of a gray, methodical existence. No close friends, no family, just work and long, solitary walks along the Charles River. The first few years were the hardest. Every ambulance siren made her jump. Every whiff of smoke triggered violent flashbacks. She saw the face of Thomas, the young amputee soldier who had never asked to die for personal revenge. She saw Lucien, the courageous Frenchman who had dared to testify and had been rewarded with a gruesome death. She saw Peterson, the innocent driver desperately banging on the locked doors. But she also saw Cole Sommer's box, the 42 teeth, the child's incisor, the blood-stained gold crowns. And when these images woke her in the middle of the night, drenched in a cold sweat, she repeated the same thing to herself. She had stopped a monster. The price was terrible, but the alternative would have been worse. This justification helped him to survive, not to live, to survive. In 1952, 7 years after the end of the war, she received an unexpected visit. A man in his 30s dressed in a simple suit, with steel-framed glasses, carrying a worn leather briefcase. He introduced himself as Daniel Mercer, a military historian working on a project to document medical operations during the Second World War. "Mrs. Brooks, I would like to ask you a few questions about your service in France, in particular about the accident of November 9, 1944. Evelyn felt her blood run cold. 7 years. She had thought it was over, that the past would remain buried with the charred corpses on that bridge. but she maintained a neutral expression, offering her visitor tea and sitting calmly in her worn armchair by the window. "That was a long time ago, Mr. Mercer. I'm not sure I can be of much help." Daniel Mercer opened his briefcase and took out a thick folder. "I consulted the military archives. Something in this particular file intrigued me." He placed several documents on the coffee table between them. The explosion that destroyed the ambulance. The official report concluded it was caused by an enemy explosive device, but I found some inconsistencies. Evelyn took a sip of tea to compose herself. Her hand wasn't trembling. She had learned to control her physical reactions over the years. "What kind of inconsistencies?" The bomb disposal experts who examined the area after the crash mentioned in their preliminary report that the explosion crater appeared to have originated from inside the vehicle, not underneath. But this remark disappeared from the final report. He glanced at it over his glasses, as if someone had decided that this information wasn't relevant. Deminers sometimes make mistakes. It was the chaos of war. Indeed. Daniel Mercer produced another document. "But there's more. I found Sergeant Sommer's medical file, a fascinating man, a decorated hero, admired by his peers." He paused deliberately. There was a psychiatric memo from 1943, classified as confidential, recommending behavioral monitoring. This recommendation was never followed. Evelyn gripped her cup tighter. "I don't understand what you're getting at, Mr. Mercer." "I also found something extraordinary among the personal effects returned to the Sommer family. A box containing what the mother described as white stones. A curious collection for a soldier, isn't it?" He leaned forward. "I asked to examine these stones. The mother agreed, not really understanding why a historian would be interested in her son's pebbles." The silence in the room became unbearable. Evelyn could hear her own heart beating against her ribcage. "They weren't stones, Mrs. Brooks. They were human teeth. 42 to be exact. Some with visible dental work. Crowns, fillings, adult teeth and—" He paused, letting the weight of the next word hang in the air. "Children's teeth." Evelyn closed her eyes. 7 years of waiting for this moment. 7 years knowing it would inevitably come. The truth never stays buried forever. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I kept digging. I found testimonies from French soldiers who served with Sommer, from civilians who survived pacification operations where he was present, horrifying stories of massacres, summary executions, entire families vanished." Daniel Mercer placed a photograph on the table. "This family, for example, the Merciers, father, mother, 2 boys, an 8-year-old girl. Executed in September 1944 near Rouen for alleged collaboration. A French witness, a soldier named Lucien Beaumont, tried to testify against Sommer after this incident." Evelyn opened her eyes and looked at the photograph. An ordinary, smiling family, probably photographed before the war. The little girl had ribbons in her hair. "Lucien Beaumont died in the ambulance crash on November 9th. Daniel Mercer continued softly. "Along with Sommer and 4 other men, all of whom were part of Sommer's unit. Also, a young soldier named Thomas Porter who had no connection to that group, and a driver named Peterson." He took off his glasses and cleaned them slowly. "It's a remarkable coincidence, don't you think? That all those specific men happened to be in that exact ambulance that day?" Evelyn set down her teacup. Her hands were perfectly steady now. A strange feeling of peace washed over her. After 7 years of secrecy, someone finally knew. Someone had put the puzzle together. "What do you want, Mr. Mercer? To denounce me? To have me arrested?" "I want to understand." He put his glasses back on. "You were the head nurse. You controlled medical evacuations. You had access to medications, protocols, schedules. If someone wanted to make sure that certain specific men were in a specific ambulance at a specific time." He left the sentence hanging. "You are accusing me of causing this accident." "I'm not accusing anyone. I'm reconstructing what really happened." Daniel Mercer leaned back in his chair. Do you know what else I've discovered? The 4 men who died with Sommer were all part of his inner circle. They were always together. In every village, on every operation, in every suspicious incident. It wasn't just Sommer. It was an organized group. So you understand why they had to be arrested. The words had slipped out before Evelyn could stop them. An involuntary confession after 7 years of absolute silence. Daniel Mercer nodded slowly. I understand. But there was Lucien Beaumont, Thomas Porter, the driver Peterson, innocent people. I know. Evelyn's voice broke for the first time. I see their faces every night for the past 7 years. Do you think I've forgotten that I sleep peacefully telling myself it was necessary? She stood abruptly, walking to the window. Thomas was 19. He wanted to be a teacher. Lucien was the only one brave enough to testify. Peterson had 3 children waiting for him at home. So why? Evelyn whirled around. Because they were going to be transferred. Sommer and his group were due to leave for Germany in 2 weeks. Do you understand what that meant? They were going to cross through a routed Germany. Millions of terrified civilians, families fleeing, lost children, and Cole Sommer with his collection of human trophies in the middle of that chaos. She stepped forward to Daniel Mercer. How many more teeth would he have collected? 50, 100, 200. How many families massacred? How many mutilated children? You could have reported him. To whom? Evelyn laughed bitterly. To the army that had buried psychiatric evaluations? To the officers who turned a blind eye to massacres of civilians as long as the advance continued? To a system that needed heroes and would never have admitted that one of its decorated sergeants was a monster? She shook her head. I would have been discredited, maybe institutionalized, and Sommer would have carried on. So you've decided to become judge, jury, and executioner. I decided to do what no one else would do. Stop a serial killer who wore an American uniform. Daniel Mercer looked at her for a long time. And what about the innocent people who died with him? They are my eternal damnation. Evelyn sat back down, suddenly exhausted. You want me to tell you I regret it? I regret every second. I see their faces in my nightmares. I hear them screaming. But if I could go back in time... She looked up at him. I would do exactly the same thing again. Silence fell between them again, heavy with all the impossible truths that war contains. Daniel Mercer slowly put his documents away in his briefcase. I'm not going to report you, Mrs. Brooks. Evelyn looked at him surprised. Why? Because you're right. Cole Sommer was a monster, and the system that should have stopped him failed. He closed his briefcase. But I'm going to write about him, about what he really was, about his collection, about the massacres, about the fact that the U.S. military allowed a serial killer to operate freely for 2 years. He stood up. And I'll mention that an anonymous nurse may have been the only person brave enough to stop him. That wasn't courage, that was murder. The two can coexist. Daniel Mercer walked towards the door, then stopped. One last question. How do you live with this burden? Evelyn smiled sadly. I'm not living, Mr. Mercer, I'm surviving. There's a difference. Daniel Mercer never published his book. It wasn't until 23 years later, in 1975, that Evelyn understood why. She was 79 now, confined to a nursing home in Boston, her body ravaged by emphysema, and her lungs weakened by decades of guilt that weighed heavier than any physical ailment. She never received visitors. She had no one. Just the nurses who changed her sheets and brought her medication with the detached efficiency she recognized from having once practiced it herself. One October afternoon, a woman she didn't know entered her room. Around 40, with prematurely gray hair, drawn features, but an intelligent gaze. She carried the same type of worn leather briefcase that Daniel Mercer had carried 23 years earlier. Mrs. Brooks, my name is Sarah Mercer. I am Daniel Mercer's daughter. Evelyn sat up with difficulty in bed. Your father. He died 3 months ago. Pancreatic cancer. Sarah sat down in the chair by the bed. Before he died, he asked me to come see you. He told me everything. About Cole Sommer. About you. About what really happened on that bridge in 1944. Evelyn closed her eyes. Even now, 3 decades later, hearing those words instantly transported her back to that moment. The explosion, the flames, the muffled screams behind locked doors. Why did he never publish his book? Sarah opened the briefcase and took out a thick manuscript held together by a worn rubber band. He wrote it, the whole thing. 347 pages documenting Cole Sommer's crimes, the Army's complicity, and what he called Evelyn Brooks's impossible moral dilemma. She placed the manuscript on the nightstand, but he never sought to publish it. For what? Because after meeting you, he continued his research, and he discovered something that even you didn't know. Evelyn opened her eyes abruptly. What? Sarah pulled out a series of documents yellowed with age. My father was obsessed with this story. He spent years tracking down witnesses, compiling evidence, reconstructing Cole Sommer's every move during the war. She spread the documents out on the bed. And he discovered that the Army knew. Not just the psychiatric evaluation from 1943. They knew everything. Evelyn's blood seemed to freeze in her veins. What do you mean? There were reports, complaints filed by French soldiers, testimonies from civilians, anonymous letters sent to higher command. Sarah pointed to one document in particular. This report is dated July 1944. An American captain named Richardson describes in detail what he calls the extremely concerning activities of Sergeant Sommer and his unit. He mentions unauthorized executions, mutilation of corpses, and calls for an immediate investigation. And what happened? Captain Richardson was transferred to Italy 2 weeks later. The report was classified, sensitive, and buried. Sarah produced another document. This one is from a military chaplain, Father Thomas Brennan. He wrote to the command in August 1944 that he had heard things in confession that defy all moral comprehension concerning Sommer. He begged for action. The chaplain was transferred to England a few days later. Evelyn felt something break inside her, a new, terrible understanding of what her loneliness had been. They knew. They all knew, and they did nothing. Worse than that, Sarah produced the most devastating document. My father found an internal memo from High Command dated October 15, 1944. A month after the ambulance accident, the memo discusses the fortuitous elimination of the Sommer problem and notes with satisfaction that the matter was resolved without public exposure or negative impact on troop morale. Evelyn remained frozen, the document trembling in her hands. The words danced before her eyes. Accidental elimination. They thought it was a providential accident. They were grateful the problem was gone. Wait. A horrible thought crossed Evelyn's mind. If they knew about Sommer, did they know about me? Did they know what I had done? Sarah hesitated, then nodded slowly. My father found a handwritten note attached to the memo, written by Major Harrison, your commanding officer. It reads, Nurse Brooks showed remarkable judgment in selecting patients for evacuation. Commendation recommended for her exemplary service. The silence that followed was deafening. Evelyn was trying to understand, to piece together the final truth that lay hidden behind 30 years of guilt. Harrison knew. He understood what I had done. My father thought so. Harrison was a smart officer, all of Sommer's problem men in a single ambulance. The head nurse personally taking another nurse's place that day. An accidental explosion that solved a problem the command didn't dare face officially. Sarah gathered the documents. My father believed Harrison understood perfectly, and that he chose to say nothing. Because I had done their dirty work. Exactly. You eliminated a monster that the Army had created, protected, and lacked the courage to destroy itself. Sarah closed the briefcase. You thought you acted alone, that you alone bore the moral weight of this massacre. But the truth is, you were a tool, an instrument of extrajudicial justice that the system used and then ignored. Evelyn sank back against her pillows. 30 years. 30 years believing she had acted of her own volition, driven by her conscience and her despair. 30 years carrying the guilt like a personal cross. And now discovering that all this time, she had been a piece on the chessboard of a larger game. Your father. Why did he never publish all of this? Sarah smiled sadly. Because he liked you, Mrs. Brooks. He didn't want the world to know. Not because he was protecting you, but because he thought you deserved to be judged for everything you did, not just the murder. She stood up. He always said you did something terrible to stop something even worse, and that the only real crime was that you were put in that position. I still killed innocent people. Yes, and my father never downplayed it. Sarah walked toward the door, then turned back, but he also told me something else. He tracked down the Mercier family children. Do you remember? The family with the 8-year-old girl whose teeth Sommer took? Evelyn nodded, tears now flowing freely down her hollow cheeks. All 3 children survived. They had been left by the roadside after their parents were executed. They were taken in by a convent, grew up, and had lives. Not easy lives, but lives nonetheless. Sarah took a photograph from her pocket. This is Louise Mercier, the youngest. She's 60 now. She's a grandmother. She lives in Lyon. She placed the photo on the bedside table. A smiling woman surrounded by grandchildren in front of a country house. My father found her 10 years ago. He told her what had happened to the man who killed her parents, how an anonymous nurse had ensured he could never hurt anyone again. Sarah stopped in the doorway. Louise told my father to give you a message if he ever saw you again. She said, "Tell her thank you. Tell her my children exist because she had the courage to do what no one else would." Sarah left, leaving Evelyn alone with her documents, her revelations, and that photograph of a woman who had survived because the monster had been stopped. Evelyn Brooks died 3 days later, in her sleep. On her bedside table, 2 things were found: Daniel Mercer's unpublished manuscript and a photograph of Louise Mercier with her grandchildren. The nurses never understood the significance of these objects. In 2008, 33 years after Evelyn's death, Sarah Mercer finally published her father's book. She added an epilogue explaining what she had discovered: that Cole Sommer was not an isolated case, that the American Army had systematically turned a blind eye to criminal behavior during the war, and that ordinary men and women had sometimes been forced to make impossible choices in a system that refused to work. The book created a major controversy. Veterans protested, historians debated, ethicists wrote articles, but no one could identify the anonymous nurse whom Daniel Mercer had protected in his manuscript. Evelyn Brooks remained a ghost, an ambiguous moral figure who posed a question no one truly wanted to confront. What would you have done if you had been the one who cared for monsters? If you had been the one who knew and no one listened to? If you had had the power to stop evil but only at the cost of innocent lives? What would you have done? Evelyn Brooks made her choice. She stood by it until her death. She never regretted it, even though she never stopped mourning the collateral victims of her personal justice. And the real final revelation, the one that even Sarah Mercer never discovered, lies in a diary that Evelyn had written during her last days, and which was thrown away with her personal belongings by an overly hasty nurse. In this diary, Evelyn had written a final confession. They all believe I acted out of morality, out of courage, to stop a monster. But the truth I've never told anyone is that in that last moment on the bridge, when I pulled the pin on the grenade and locked the doors, I didn't think about Cole Sommer's victims. I didn't think about justice or revenge. I thought about how easy it was, how simple it was to decide who would live and who would die. About that feeling of absolute power that I had always envied surgeons for holding lives in their hands. Cole Sommer collected teeth. I discovered I could collect something far more valuable, the power to decide destiny, and I wielded it with the same calculated coldness as he did. Maybe I wasn't so different from him after all. Maybe monsters always recognize other monsters. And maybe the only real crime wasn't what I did, but how natural it felt This confession was never read. It disappeared into a garbage bin along with worn sheets and yellowed photographs. But it contained the ultimate truth that Evelyn Brooks had never dared to say aloud, that by killing the collector, she herself had become a collector of souls, and that this realization was more terrifying than any war crime. So one last time I ask you, what would you have done if it were you? If you discovered today that someone you help, care for, and protect in your daily work is actually a monster, and that the system refuses to see, refuses to act? Leave your answer in the comments. And subscribe to this channel, because there are hundreds of stories like Evelyn Brooks's. Stories that history books prefer to forget. Stories of ordinary people who did extraordinarily terrible things for reasons they believed were just. Because history is never as simple as we would like to believe, and heroes are never as pure as we are led to believe.